As the world's population increases, so too the pressure on fish stocks. Pretty much half of the seafood we consume today comes from what are called aquafarms, but at what price? We may well be exposing ourselves to factory farming underwater and whatever else goes with that. You're watching Roundtable with me, David Foster. What's in the posh seafood marinara, the sushi or the plain old fish fingers you may well have eaten for lunch today? Do you know, indeed do you care, if it's come from an aqua farm? It is a burgeoning industry, pretty vital too if we want to keep putting fish on our menus.
It's sold to us as a vital part of our diet. Fish accounts for about 15% of our protein intake worldwide. But with a growing population and pressure on our oceans, is aquaculture the best way to manage supply? And what is the cost to both sea life and people? Nearly half of all the fish we consume today comes from aquafarms. The industry has grown rapidly since the 1970s as a way to manage overfishing in the wild.
Right now, the oceans are depleting from fish. What's left over there is being polluted, and there is a big problem to deliver to the markets the needed seafood.
In 2014, aquaculture accounted for about 73 million tonnes of fish worldwide. Today, it's more like 100 million tonnes. With the industry expected to grow even further, attention has turned to how sustainable the practice actually is. Farmed salmon is one of the UK's most valuable food exports. In 2013, cages off the coast of northwest Scotland provided about 35,000 tonnes to the EU and nearly 26,000 to the US. In general, Scotland offers a premium product based on quality feed and fewer fish in confined spaces. But this isn't the case worldwide. Animal activists have spoken out about the increase in so-called battery farms underwater. Disease outbreaks such as sea lice have dogged the industry in recent years, and escaped farmed fish have been blamed for disrupting ecosystems in the wild. 90% of the world's wild fish stocks are already at capacity or overfished. While catch quotas have helped replenish some species, more work needs to be done. Countries like Norway have turned to aquaculture to help stem wild catch without compromising supply. It's also become an important economic driver for isolated rural areas as well as developing countries. Aquafarming has made our favourite fish much cheaper and more accessible. By 2030, it's expected to make up nearly 2/3 of the fish we consume. Is this mass-produced food group compromising nutrition? And what are the trade-offs to our health and environment?
Very pleased to say that joining us for this roundtable we have from Edinburgh in Scotland, Craig Burton, Regional Manager at the UK Seafish Industry Authority. Phil Brooke is here in the studio. He's from Compassion in World Farming, an animal welfare campaign group. We also have George Hyde here, who teaches in the Fisheries, Aquaculture and Marine Studies Department at Sparsholt College, that is in Hampshire, in the south of England. Thanks to each and every one of you for joining us here. But let me come to you first of all. We need this. What's wrong with it?
Well, one of the key problems in, shall we say, Western countries is that we are growing carnivorous species of fish. We are having to feed them on large amounts of fish meal and oil, which comes out of the sea. So fish farming continues to require overfishing of the seas. The second thing is that's being replaced by soybeans, just like for our chickens and pigs. And that involves cutting down rainforests and so forth very often to apply and the cerrado in Brazil to feed those fish. So the problem is we have a relatively unsustainable industry, and we're also keeping breeds of fish that are not necessarily adapted to the conditions in which they
So since we need more fish, what do we do?
So one of the answers we think, in fact, is that we need to adjust consumption in relation to what is possible. We need to cut overfishing so the seas can produce more fish. We need to try and develop more sustainable forms of aquaculture. That could include mussels, it could include carp aquaculture, and there may be other species like tilapia which feed on more vegetarian or omnivorous diets that can be kept more sustainably. But ultimately, it still takes, even for relatively efficient aquaculture, 5 kilos of protein to make 1 kilo of fish. And that's not an efficient way to grow our food. We really need to start looking at eating fish as well as meat in moderation.
There are fish farmers, I should say, who now maintain that it's pretty much 2 kilos of food needed for 1 kilo of fish. But I think you're pointing out...
I can answer that one.
Okay, well, we'll ask you to throw that one in later. Craig, it's unsustainable because what we're doing to get the fish is wrong. We're using too many other fish to get the fish we want to eat, and also we're chopping down rainforests to get the plant food that some fish want to eat.
Well, at the end of the day, seafood, fish, is an important component of the diet. It's an important protein source, and it's very rich in omega-3 fatty acids and some of its other essential minerals and things like that. And yes, it does have an impact on the environment, and it does have an impact on fisheries. We do catch fish to feed to fish. Unfortunately, the consumer tends to like fish that eat other fish and isn't so keen on the vegetarian fish that are out there. And it does maybe take 4 or 5 kilos of wild caught fish to produce 1 kilo of farmed fish. But that's actually quite efficient if you were to compare it with what a wild fish would have to eat to attain the same weight. And on a protein basis, certainly marine fish farming is actually a net producer of marine protein now rather than a net consumer of marine proteins. We could move down the food chain, and we do farm mussels quite extensively here in Scotland and around the world. And they're actually getting a lot more consumer acceptance. But for the likes of carp and tilapia, they've got some very niche markets, but unfortunately, certainly in the Western and developing worlds, the developed worlds, they are maybe not high on the list of what the consumer actually wants. So whilst we could produce them, it's getting the consumer to actually eat them.
Let's go through some of the reasons why people have said they don't like aquaculture, fish farming, or whatever you want to call it, over the last 10 to 15 years. I pulled up an article from The Guardian in 2008, and you're going to tell me whether these problems still exist, George, if you would. Disease, lice in particular with salmon, and the treatment of salmon to get rid of the lice. Is it still a major problem? Because it can then infect wild salmon.
It is still a major problem, and it's been the biggest problem for the industry for the last 30 plus years. But the industry is putting enormous investment into combating sea lice, and they're moving away from pesticide treatment, which has got its sort of environmental problems associated with it, and they are using more and more alternative treatments that include physical methods such as removing the lice by water pressure,
there's a warm water treatment.
By pressure, by washing the fish, and by warm water treatment, and also keeping the lice out. They put barriers around the cages, and they've also got biological control where they're putting in other fish in the cages with the lice in order to eat the lice.
Okay,
so there's a lot of strategies going on.
You say it's been a problem for 30 plus years and it hasn't been solved yet.
Yes, but I think it is it's being managed. And I think in the long term they will solve it, but it is definitely their biggest problem.
Okay, another one I got.
But the actual pesticides going in is reducing because of these alternatives.
Antibiotics used to keep the fish supposedly healthy.
Yeah, well that is a real misnomer. That is from 30 years ago. There was a lot of antibiotics used. Now all the bacterial diseases are pretty much controlled in salmon farming with vaccination, which prevents the disease. And so in agriculture in the UK, fish use only 0.5% of antibiotic use compared to other land animals. So it's virtually no antibiotics are used in aquaculture, even though it's often reported as being used.
When you talk about means of cleaning the fish, some of the fish that I have bought in the past smells of chlorine. almost as if it's been washed in chlorine. There's talk of hydrogen peroxide being used.
Yeah, hydrogen peroxide is one of the treatments, but that's
what's used
one
to
of the
bleach
most,
people's hair.
Yeah, but it's one of the most environmentally friendly treatments. It kills the lice on the outside of the fish, and it breaks down into water and oxygen virtually immediately. So, and there's no trace of it when that fish is harvested.
Let's go to Craig, then come back to you
immediately.
What about chlorine?
If your fish smells of chlorine, yes, it may well have had a chlorine dip during processing, but that would not be common in any processor in the United Kingdom. So the fish, depending on which species it is, may well have been imported from another source abroad. Any chlorine levels, though, that do remain within the fish would be well within the legal permitted limits.
Now, one of the arguments in this same article to which I'm referring was that fish farming takes the pressure off wild stocks. Is that one of the ways that you could view it, Craig? And then we'll come back to you, Phil, on that.
Yes, very much so. I mean, wild fisheries have plateaued for a number of years now. It's possible that with improved management measures that fishery landings may increase over the longer term. It's also possible that obviously with more conservative fisheries management, as we bring stocks back up to healthy levels, that actually wild fishery landings may actually decrease, which obviously gives us a bit of a gap in the protein sources. I mean, the FAO at the moment are estimating that 2/3 of all the fish consumed worldwide will be from aquaculture sources by 2030, and it may well increase from there on. I mean, the projections.
We'll get into how vital it is in terms of a food source in just a moment. But what about that argument, Phil, that, you know, we've heard for years and years about overfishing, plundering of the oceans, quotas put on this, quotas put on that. If you actually just farm fish, then the wild salmon or the wild sea bass or whatever else, they're going to, well, there won't be so much pressure on them.
But the reasons for eating fish, for example, like omega-3, that's a limited resource, and all the omega-3 in practice so far that's in aquaculture comes from wild fish. If you want to increase it, you want to grow algae. I took an algal oil tablet this morning. The better way is to feed that straight to people. I want also to come back on.
Sorry, are you saying that salmon grown in a fish farm, as opposed to wild salmon, has no omega-3?
It does have omega-3 because of the fish oil in the diet, and the fish oil in the diet came from the wild fish.
So it's not producing its own.
It's not all the long chain omega-3, the DHA in the diet, comes from algae at the top of the food chain, and as it passes down the food chain,
they don't get it.
The animals destroy it on the way down. They absorb some of it, so it remains in the wild fish.
But if you grow your fish, grow your salmon in a farm, then you're not going to have the pressure on the wild fish out there. They're not going to need to catch quite so many. That's got to be good, isn't it?
But so long as you need to use wild fish in the diets, you do. So long as you cut the wild fish in the diets, you end up with a product that's not the same as it used to be.
But it's not so much wild fish in the diets now.
There is much less wild fish in the diet. There's much less fish meal, and also the fish oil in the diet is now about 1/3 fish oil and 2/3 vegetable oil, which has reduced the level of omega-3 in the end product of the fish. It's not so good, but it's still our best source of long-chain omega-3s, and we are recommended to eat 1 portion of oily fish a week, and farm salmon still hits that requirement, even having been fed 2/3 vegetable oil.
How vital is it that we increase the number of fish in the world, because of their wonderful source of protein? You go to a country like Bangladesh, they've talked about the fact that if they were able to sort of change the diet by 15% towards fish, then the number of people suffering from malnutrition symptoms would fall dramatically.
Yeah, well, and I think if you look at global statistics, the number of quantity of fish eaten per person has gone up year on year. Since the 60s, it's more than doubled, and also the world population is increasing. So we've got to get more fish from somewhere, and it's very limited what we can get from the sea. So
but we're not just eat nuts. I mean that in the broadest sense. Do we really have to eat fish?
Well, I think also if you look at it, the one place on the planet that hasn't really been exploited yet in terms of agriculture is our seas. I think it's less than 0.1% of the global continental shelf has actually got fish farming on it. So whereas you look at our land, it's we're almost at the limit of space on land to produce food. So we've got enormous potential to produce more fish in the sea.
You used the word exploit.
Well,
it hasn't been exploited yet.
But maybe that's a wrong term to use. But I think that is what we do with agriculture. When we produce our food, we exploit the environment. Every bit of food we eat has an impact on the environment.
Craig, what's the danger here of us turning the seas or the product of the seas, these fish, into something that is just used for human, well, not human exploitation. Humans are exploiting it to their own ends and not really caring about the end result?
I don't think there's much danger on that. I mean, the fish is a very valuable protein source. I mean, government guidelines in the United Kingdom, we should be eating 2 portions of fish a week. Very few consumers do that. And in fact, I mean, the UK consumer, I think we sit at just over 1 portion of fish a week, about 1.2 portions of fish a week. So we should be doubling our fish consumption here in the UK, let alone taking the wider view as to the role of fish proteins around the world.
But how do we avoid exploiting the end product, which happens to be the fish, and our oceans in terms of they supply, to some extent, the food? How do we avoid the exploitation of the environment here?
We're not, well, yes, you can use exploitation. It's a very emotive word. We are utilising the sea, and we're utilising the resources that are available within the sea. We're turning forms of protein that the consumer doesn't find acceptable, like a lot of the small fish like anchoveta and some of the horse mackerels and things like this, where there's very low consumer acceptance, into a very valuable source of protein that consumers will accept and do eat. And therefore there is a net gain all round. In terms of exploiting the animals themselves, certainly in the developed world, we've actually got we've got very, very high standards. And we are leading, hopefully, some of the developing nations as well into adopting standards. Yes, maybe there is a degree of us taking a very cosy Western view of everything, because we are very protein rich, we're very food rich. And in some of these developing nations, they have a problem in actually getting sufficient food for themselves, let alone having the luxury of sitting back and saying, oh no, you shouldn't do that, it's totally wrong.
Phil, what's Compassionate World Farming's view about that phrase, just utilising our ocean's resources?
Well, I think that we need to utilise the Earth's resources better, and in general the more efficient way to do that is to eat more plants. If you want more fish for protein in Bangladesh, then their fish aquaculture is largely based on carp, which live in ponds and can be kept much more sustainably. If we want to feed everybody in the West on 1 or 2 portions of fish a week, which have the omega-3 fatty acids, that cannot be supplied by the world's fish, whether caught for salmon or provided directly. If we want to increase that, we have to grow algae, and we need to start adding the algal oils to other foods. That would be a much more efficient way of achieving that without raping the oceans, without extending factory farming into the seas, which is not the way we want to go forward in the future.
So how far have we come, George? And how far do we have to go to make this viable, to make people like Phil think, okay, it's not so bad?
It's early days with algal oils, but they are definitely being added to fish food now, and then replacing part of the fish oil component. So we're making strides that way.
And have you known that this would be a good idea for a long time, or is this recent?
That's relatively recently, the use of the algal oil. And being
no, I'm talking about not but the use. I'm talking about, have you known that it would be a good thing to do?
Yes, I think they've known for a long time, but getting the technology
why hasn't it been done before?
Well, it's not easy, I think, to grow marine algae just like that. But I think the alternatives to our culture in the Western world, we want to eat these carnivorous fish, and I think it's very difficult to change people from wanting to eat salmon and cod and to move them onto these more omnivorous species. So. And I think it's a better alternative, the farm version, than the wild version, because as Craig said at the start, a wild fish has eaten a great deal more fish from the oceans. If you're going to harvest it to eat. A wild cod or a wild salmon, for instance, has eaten more than 10 times its weight in fish.
Help me here, because I'm not an expert on this, and you guys are. When you talked about carnivorous fish such as cod and salmon, are they, when they're being farmed, do they have to be fed on?
No, they don't have to. You
So
just
they
have
can be
to,
fed on a plant
yeah.
base. And what does that do to the fish? If it is a carnivorous fish and you suddenly make it into a vegetarian?
You just have to know the nutritional requirements of the fish, and it will grow perfectly well, particularly the protein, as long as you supply the right amino acids and the right requirements. And we have fed, at our college, we do research for the feed companies, and we have grown trout, which are purely carnivorous animal, vegetarian diets, and they've been perfectly healthy and tasted fine.
What's the biggest problem facing the industry at the moment?
If you look at the salmon industry in Scotland, it is a disease of sea lice. I think the developments with the feed it has worked very well. And
Should we ask George what they're doing up there with regard to the sea lice? Because this has been the headline problem for the last 15, 20 years, hasn't it? And it's infecting wild stocks as well.
Sea lice is a big problem for the industry, and they have been getting very creative about treating it. When they are using medications now, they are bringing, rather than trying to treat a pen of fish, they are actually pumping the fish from the pen into a wellboat, which is a closed containment within a vessel. They can treat the fish very effectively there. They can then pump the treated fish back and take the treatment waters away for safe disposal on shore. They are using, as George said earlier, thermal treatments, which is a bath treatment, again using warmed waters, which makes the lice drop off.
There was a terrible accident with that, wasn't there, where 150,000 fish were killed because somebody got the temperature wrong?
Yeah, it's an emerging technology. It's not perfect yet, but it is going to be developed. As with all new technologies, there are glitches along the way.
Phil, I think, wants to say something to you, Craig, if that's okay.
But one of the key the death rate wasn't caused, I think, by the temperature wrong. It was by putting sick fish with gill disease in the thermolyzer. But the problem.
But this is an isolated incident.
There have been several incidents in both Norway and in Scotland with thermolysers, with hydrogen peroxide, with hydrolysers. Not so much a hydrolyser, a different one called a schemic delouser. And all of the problem is that all of these methods, which are definitely more environmentally friendly, are all extremely stressful to the fish. They involve taking the fish out the water, well, out of their cage. It pumps through water into either hydrogen peroxide, which is very aversive, even if it then later breaks down. So the experience for the fish can be very bad, and if they're slightly sick, it's highly stressful. And we shouldn't be needing routinely to apply stressful treatments to our farm animals. It is a sign that the system isn't sustainable at the levels at which we're currently farming.
Come back on that, Craig.
I would well, I mean, we treat livestock on land for various diseases, various problems. Yeah, we herd them together. We put them in cattle crushers and things like that. You could equally argue that they experience stress.
Well, I think Compassion World Farming would do exactly that.
It's very, very difficult to move animals around without causing them some level of stress. Obviously, the industry doesn't want to stress its animals any more than it needs to. And yes, there may well have been an mimic gill disease involved in that particular thermolyse incident. But again, you know, they are looking at biological controls, such as cleaner fish in the cages alongside the salmon that grow alongside them, and those that actually go around and pick the lice off physically.
I'm going to have to sort of wrap this up a little bit, gentlemen.
Okay.
But I'm going to come to George first of all. I'm going to ask each one of you, which tastes better, wild fish or farmed fish?
I think you're more consistent with a farmed fish, because a wild fish will vary all through its life. It's also harvested in a much more humane way than a wild fish, and that makes the flesh quality better.
You would rather have?
I think I would, if it's a salmon, I'd rather have a farm salmon, yes.
Craig?
I would want to know the source of my farm salmon, actually. To be honest, if it was Scottish salmon, it's as equal to, in my mind, to the wild fish.
Phil, let me ask you this. Do you think enough steps have been taken, enough strides have been made in the last 10 years, perhaps through pressure groups such as yours, to improve this industry and believe that it will improve further?
I think the industry has taken a lot of steps to improve welfare. I think it's entirely positive that, for example, that the Scottish salmon and the British trout industry are certified by the RSPCA. But the problem remains that we are taking a species that is solitary, that is migratory, and putting them in a cage to swim round and round. And that's not the way that kind of fish should live.
Craig, I'll allow you a last word.
I'd just like to pick up on the fact that salmon are solitary. They're not. At sea, salmon are a shoaling fish. That's what makes the at-sea fishery so efficient on salmon.
We're not going to settle any arguments here today, but I think the belief is that the industry has come a long way, perhaps because people such as you have been putting a bit of pressure on, and we're thankful.
Particularly the UK industry.
Okay. We're thankful for that. I'm thankful for you coming in and talking about it here on Roundtable. From my guests, from me, David Foster, thank you very much for watching. We hope to have your company next time. Bye-bye for now.